when we refused to arm and equip and train the Free Syrian Army, overruling his then Secretary of Defense, Panetta, overruling his then Secretary of State, Secretary Clinton, overruling his director of the Central Intelligence Agency, General David Petraeus. It is well known. They all recommended to arm the Free Syrian Army. At that time, Bashar Assad was in serious, serious jeopardy. So what happened to the Iranians? The same ones, the same Iranians that we are concluding this deal with, called in 5,000 Hezbollah, had Soleimani in charge of the Iranian Revolutionary Guard, while tens of thousands have been slaughtered. Well, 230,000 is one estimate. And with barrel bombing. My colleagues, do you know what barrel bombing is? It's a huge cylinder, and it's filled with explosives and shrapnel. And they drop it, and it explodes, and it spreads shrapnel everywhere. It's a terrible weapon. It's a terrible weapon. And Bashar Assad has been using it continuously. And who's giving them that stuff to use? The Iranians.
And then there's this guy, John McCain. You know, this guy talking about how bad barrel bombs are, how we had the opportunity to arm the Free Syrian rebels, right? How many deaths is he directly responsible for? I mean, how many bombs did he drop on women and children in Vietnam? How many people did he kill on that aircraft carrier that he caught on fire, right? Soldiers that he cares about so much, men and women in uniform, that he can't wait to send back into another war of choice with Iran. Oh, I care about the soldiers, our brothers and sisters in uniform. I can't wait to see more of them killed. I can't wait to see more of them separated from their families for extended periods over and over again, endlessly. I love them so much. They sacrifice so much for us. They do, because of you, Senator, because of war profiteers like you and the people that you work for. You know, you can see that he knows he is directly responsible for all this crap that he's talking about. And you know how you can see it? Because he keeps wringing his hands. You watch the video, he keeps wringing his hands like, oh my God, like his palms are all sweaty. Ugh, I can't get it off me. I have blood all over my hands. Yes, you do, Senator. You have blood all over your hands. There's no doubt you're entirely covered in blood. Oh, and he keeps pointing at himself, too. He keeps pointing at himself like he understands that, he's directly responsible. Even though, he doesn't want to, he can't admit it to anyone. He's the people who fund the psychopaths in the war, and the Pentagon, in the War House, in the Pentagon. He's a psychopath. They're psychopaths. They take and sell cluster bombs to assholes all over the world. They're being used in Yemen with made in the USA on them. Oh yeah, cluster bombs are so much more humane than fucking barrel bombs. You're such a good man, Senator. It's disgusting. And the truth is we have to know who our real enemy is. Okay, you remember when John McCain went to go meet with the Free Syrian Army guys? You remember that? He made a nice little photo op with Al-Qaeda, known members of Al-Qaeda. I'm surprised they didn't all pose together with the pallets of $100 bills that he was dropping off to them, with the pallets of weapons that he was dropping off to them, because that's who's arming ISIS, not Iran. He wants to stand up there and go, oh, this is all because of Iran. Because of Iran. The migrant problem is because of Iran. Everything is because of Iran. Wow. Wow. Okay, so The only way this war ends is that if we can all agree that the war profiteers are worse than anyone in ISIS. That's the only way this war ends. We all need to understand this. The war profiteers are worse than anyone in ISIS because ISIS would not exist without them. Start hanging the war profiteers. ISIS will dry up fairly quickly, I'm pretty sure. I would bet on it. This is the only way it ends. And if we don't stand up to make it end now, then your children's children, then it falls on your grandchildren to do it. Is that what you want? Anyways, you should watch a speech. The body language is very telling. He is a true war criminal, this guy. John McCain talking to you, pal. Okay, we need to make a video very soon called Know Your Real Enemy. Again, one of these days this war is going to end. Okay? Till that day, stay cool. Hopefully we'll all see that day. And the only way it's going to happen is when we all agree that the war profiteers are worse than anybody in ISIS. Because that's what the fucking truth is. They don't give a shit whose blood gets spilled, as long as they make a buck. You know it's true, Senator. Thank you all.
Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent that further proceedings under the quorum call be suspended, and I ask to address the Senate as if in morning business.
Without objection. The quorum is rescinded.
Mr. President, after a few hours from now, the Senate will vote again on the Iranian deal, and I think it's pretty well known that no votes will change, and it's very unfortunate that that's the case. But it will give our colleagues, hopefully they may have contemplated how bad a deal this is and possibly change, but obviously we know the likelihood of that is unlikely. And the virtues of this legislation have been emphasized by my friends on the other side of the aisle, and those of us who have grave and serious concern have also been articulated. But I think it's well to point out that this will be the first major agreement or treaty in history that is voted on strict party lines. Not one single senator on this side of the aisle will be voting in favor. Not one. A degree of partisanship concerning an issue of the greatest importance in my deal of any treaty or agreement since that agreement that Neville Chamberlain made with Adolf Hitler in Munich in 1938. So that part of it is in my view, a failure on the part of the President of the United States. I know many of us, including myself, were willing to listen and consider any agreement that was verifiable and enforceable that would have prevented the Iranians from acquiring nuclear weapons. In fact, it was stated by the Secretary of State that this object of this agreement was that Iran would never have nuclear capability, and now we all know it's a matter of time. Now, whether it's 1 month or 10 years or 15 years, whatever, we don't know. They notoriously cheat. That's one thing we do know. So the fact is that we went from preventing Iran from having nuclear capability, and they came to the table not because of renewed zeal for that, but because their economy was so badly hurt because of the sanctions that had been imposed on them, and after this deal can never be reimposed. Let's be frank and candid with our colleagues and with the American people. So here we're faced with a agreement that has been, which should have been a treaty. I know of no observer of the Constitution, both known as liberal interpreters or conservative, so who interpret the Constitution, agree that this is anything but a treaty of transcendent importance, and we, of course, are treating it as a, quote, agreement. Well, the bad news, I say to my colleagues on the other side of the aisle who will be voting for this, is the next president of the United States can repeal this, can negate it. Now, that wouldn't have been the case if it was a treaty, because then it had been ratified by the Constitution and the Congress, and specifically the Senate of the United States. So in the short term, apparently the president and his minions have succeeded. In the long term, this will cause a grave threat to the security of the United States of America. And I say to my colleagues, you know, this is an agreement that we are discussing, and I will talk about the failings of it as I see them. But far more importantly, the President of the United States and the Secretary of State treat this as if it were in a vacuum. It is not a vacuum. It is not a vacuum. You cannot consider this agreement unless you look at what's happening in the entire world today. According to anyone who is an expert on national security, including people like Henry Kissinger and Madeleine Albright and Brent Scowcroft, and the list goes on, the world has never been in more turmoil than it is today. And that doesn't take a great deal of intelligence or study. All you have to do is watch television or read a newspaper. The United Nations head of refugees has said, there has never been more refugees in the world since World War II than there is today. You can't turn on the television without seeing the plight of these terrible plight of these refugees who have had to flee their country because of the brutality and genocide committed by Bashar Assad. You can't do that without it. And some in the media and some on my friends on the liberal side treat this as if it were a hurricane, an earthquake, a natural disaster that just sort of happened. It didn't just happen, and it didn't have to happen. What has happened with these refugees is a direct result of the failed, feckless policies of this administration in general and this president in particular. This is the president of the United States who overruled his national security team when they said that we should arm and equip and train Free Syrian Army to go in there and fight against Bashar Assad. This is the same president that said it's not a matter of when, it's a matter of whether Bashar Assad leaves office. This is the president of the United States that announced to the world that Bashar Assad had crossed the red line and we were going to retaliate, only, of course, to hear that the president decided not to. And I tell my colleagues, you cannot overstate the impact that the president's decision had after he warned Bashar Assad, after he said that if they crossed the red line, we would act, and we didn't. I'm not sure that many Americans are aware that the Saudis had aircraft on the runways ready to join in those attacks, and they found out on CNN. Is it an accident that we have seen the Saudis visiting Moscow? Is it an accident that for the first time in history we see the Saudis buying Russian equipment? Is it astonishing to our colleagues and friends that the Saudis have taken it upon themselves, along with UAE and other Gulf states, to intervene in Yemen against the Houthis, who are Iranian-backed, Iranian-trained, Iranian-equipped? No, it's not an accident, and none of these things have happened by accident. Now we see We see a nation called Syria with over 230,000 killed, millions in refugee status. The surrounding countries, particularly the small ones, particularly Jordan and Lebanon, literally overwhelmed with refugees. Today, I tell my colleagues, there are more Syrian children in school in Lebanon than there are Lebanese children in Lebanon. When you look at the size of the influx of the refugees into these two countries, some wonder in some ways how they have maintained their stability. And all of it did not have to happen. It didn't have to happen. The President of the United States decided to withdraw every single one of our combat troops from Iraq, saying at the time, we are leaving a prosperous, free, democratic Iraq. Does anybody believe that? And of course, so many of us who argued, please leave a sustaining force behind, which they could have, and anyone says that we couldn't have is lying, and I don't use that word casually. Because Lindsey Graham and John McCain were in Baghdad when Maliki said, okay, I'll keep troops. I will keep American troops. How many? How many in what mission? That answer never came from this administration until that the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff testified before the Senate Armed Services Committee that it was down to 3,500. In his words, it cascaded down to 3,500. So now here we are with the greatest humanitarian crisis of again, since World War II, 70 years ago. And here we are with this situation and Americans' heart going out to these people. Can any of us who saw the picture of the drowned little baby on the beach ever forget that? Again, it didn't have to happen. It was because this president and this administration and his minions refused to exercise American leadership. When we refused to arm and equip and train the Free Syrian Army, overruling his then Secretary of Defense, Panetta, overruling his then Secretary of State, Secretary Clinton, overruling his director of the Central Intelligence Agency, General David Petraeus, it is well known, they all recommended to arm the Free Syrian Army. At that time, Bashar Assad was in serious jeopardy. So what happened to the Iranians? The same ones, the same Iranians that we are concluding this deal with, called in 5,000 Hezbollah, had Soleimani in charge of the Iranian Revolutionary Guard, while tens of thousands have been slaughtered, well, 230,000 is one estimate, and with barrel bombing. My colleagues, do you know what barrel bombing is? It's a huge cylinder, and it's filled with explosives and shrapnel. And they drop it, and it explodes, and it spreads shrapnel everywhere. It's a terrible weapon. It's a terrible weapon. And Bashar Assad has been using it continuously, and who's giving them that stuff to use? The Iranians. The Iranians are the ones that are doing it. It's the Iranians that are supporting the Shiite militias in Baghdad. It's the Iranians that are supporting the Houthis, which have taken over a great part of Yemen and would have taken over all of it if it had been up to us as we sat by and watched. And the Saudis and UAE have decided to go in because they could not afford to have, look at where Yemen is on the map, they could not afford to have Yemen under the control of the Iranians. So here we are. Now, the news of the last few days is, guess what? The Russians are now building bases, a serious military buildup in Syria. Why? Because they have to prop up Bashar Assad. And this misguided, delusional administration thinks that only they can attack ISIS and not attack Bashar Assad and his killing machine. My friends, in the name of human decency, in the name of the United States of America's tradition of helping those who are being slaughtered, we should tell Bashar Assad, you can't fly those weapons anymore, those helicopters and those planes anymore, and drop these terrible weapons. We're going to shoot you down if you do it. And we're going to establish a safe zone on the Turkish border. And we're going to have the refugees come there. And we're going to feed them, and we're going to clothe them, and we're going to take care of them. And don't you fly an airplane over here, or we're going to shoot it down. That's the message we should have to Bashar Assad. And now, what's happening now? The Russians have decided that they are going to intervene militarily on the side of Bashar Assad. Now, my friends, it has been Vladimir Putin's practice and ambition to expand the quote, near abroad. That means moving into Ukraine, taking Crimea in violation of the Budapest Agreement. It means putting huge pressures on the Baltics. It means propaganda campaigns and other pressures that are even on countries like Sweden and Norway in the Arctic. All of these things Vladimir Putin is doing is sort of an expanding influence from Russia. Now, my dear friends, you see him leapfrogging over to Syria to maintain his base on the Mediterranean. And that is a somewhat radical departure. But not to worry, my friends. The Secretary of State called the Foreign Minister Lavrov, the old Stalinite apparatchik that he is, and expressed his concern. So the American government expressed their concern. Well, that ought to pretty well take care of it. Meanwhile, what about China? In the last day or two, there was a meeting, and a Chinese admiral sitting between an American admiral and another admiral stated the South China Sea belongs to China. A few days ago, the President of the United States went to Alaska to rename a mountain. And, I guess that's a reason for a trip. I'll leave that to others to judge. So he goes to Alaska. And guess what happened? By coincidence, by sheer coincidence, for the first time in history, 5 Chinese warships show up off the coast of Alaska, penetrating the 12-mile zone. First time in history. Now, I'm sure that was just a coincidence that the President of the United States happened to be in Alaska at the time that these Chinese ships showed up off the coast of Alaska. Every time we turn around, we are seeing nations react to a lack of American leadership. And so we are going to, of course, now vote not to approve this agreement, because if it was a straight up or down vote, it would be a disapproval. It would be a significant disapproval, as a matter of fact, just not 60. At 50, I believe it's 57 or 58 United States senators will vote that they do not want to have this sanctions relieved that have been imposed by the Congress. It's a sad day. It's a sad day. And just as briefly as possible, because we've been over all of these before, that there's no doubt that there is almost no enforcement and verification procedures. In fact, again, for the first time, I think that the Senate of the United States is being asked to approve of an arms control agreement, which is basically what this is when you get right down to it, without knowing the verification procedures. It is a deal between the IAEA and Iran. I still don't get it, how anybody can support an agreement that we don't know the most vital elements of it. That's still beyond me. Obviously, in the place where we found some of their real secret activity buried in a mountain, that inspection will be conducted by the Iranians themselves. Remarkable, remarkable. So, and of course, the past nuclear activities, so-called PMD, one of the requirements, one of the interesting things aspects of this is to see what was said at the time in the beginning and what actually happened. Like Secretary of State saying, we must know what their previous military activities were. We must know that, because otherwise we can't. Guess what? We're not going to know that. Particularly the aspect, though, of verification bothers me about as much as anything else. So now we have the Iranian Revolutionary Guard sustaining the Shia militias in Iraq. We have the Iranians funding Hezbollah, which is now the major prop for the Bashar Assad regime. We now have the Iranians supporting the Houthis, who, as I mentioned, are there trained and equipped by the Iranians in an attempt to take over Yemen. The Iranians are now providing weapons to the Taliban in Afghanistan. Now, if they're doing all those things and they're not changing their behavior, what in the world do you think they're going to do with $100 billion? Spend it on growing poppy? Maybe building a YMCA? Of course not. They're going to continue their activities of supporting terrorist organizations throughout the Middle East with another $100 billion. This is what troubles me more than anything else. Has anyone in this body seen any indication of a change in Iranian behavior? If so, I would be more than eager to grasp that straw, because everything that I have seen and the statements, just as short a time as 2 or 3 days ago, the Grand Ayatollah says that in 25 years, Israel will no longer exist. Is that the background? Is that the atmosphere of some kind of agreement of this nature, where they're going to get an additional $100 billion? It's confounding. And it can only be explained by this incredible delusion on the part of the President and the Secretary of State that he's had for the last 6.5 years, that if we somehow get an agreement with the Iranians, there will be a new arrangement in the Middle East, and Iran and the United States will be partners against radical Islam, yada, yada, yada. That is impossible in light of Iranian stated ambitions. And of course the Israelis are deeply disturbed. Now, all I can say is that this is not a good day. This is not a good day. This is a day when votes are taken again for the second time on one of the most impactful situations in the history of this country post-World War II. And that is that this agreement will allow the Iranians to a degree of latitude and a degree of capability to spread their terror and their acts of terror throughout the Middle East in a far more effective fashion. And yes, we're war weary. Yes, Americans don't want to be involved. Yes, we know all of those things, even though it's 1% of the American population that actually serves in the military. But the fact is that sooner or later, as a result of this, the United States of America, unfortunately, will have to be engaged militarily. And I hate to make that prediction, But I have been a student of what's going on in the Middle East for a long period of time. And I have seen Iranian behavior, and I have watched what they have done, not just their rhetoric, but their behavior. They're propping up a guy who has killed 230,000 of his countrymen and women and driven millions into exile. And now we're feeling the effects of it in Europe and soon in the United States of America. It's shameful. It's shameful that we allowed this guy to slaughter so many hundreds of thousands of people. And who supported him and who backed him and who bailed him out when the President of the United States said, oh, it's not a matter of whether Bashar Assad leaves, it's a matter of when. The President of the United States said it's time for Bashar Assad to leave. Bashar Assad will be in office after this President of the United States will be. So it's not a good day. It's not a good day. There have been other times in our history. There's a good book that was written about America before World War II called While America Slept. It's another great book by a professor at Texas A&M about how unready we were prior to the Korean conflict. We're never going to be in another war, and we were totally unprepared when North Korea attacked South Korea. And now here we are, with blame on both sides of the aisle, continuing to cut our military, continue to reduce our capabilities, continuing to reach a point where the retiring Chief of Staff of the United States Army says we can no longer adequately defend the nation against some of its threats. And to cap it all off, we are now going to see an agreement which will unleash the furies of hell. Mr. President, I yield the floor.
I'm the leading state sponsor of terrorism.